first two videos in this series, I talked about the bebop dominant scale and how to combine it with arpeggios in an improvised line. So in this video, I now want to start talking about improvising over a 2-5-1 chord progression. This is the most commonly used chord progression in jazz, and you really need to familiarize yourself with it in as many different keys as possible. In the key of C major, chord 2 is D minor 7. We call it 2 because it's built on the second note, D, of a C major scale. Chord 5, to give it its full name, is G dominant 7. We just usually call it G7, and that's called chord 5 because it's built on the fifth note of a C major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And chord 1, of course, is C major 7 or C major 6. So let's look at chord 2 minor 7. The default mode for improvising over a 2 minor 7 is what we call a Dorian mode. Sounds like this. You notice all those notes in the scale, or the mode rather, were white notes. It's simply the notes of a C major scale, but starting on D. But you notice it sounds very different, and that's because by shifting the starting note, you've completely changed the order of tones and semitones. Now, the great thing about the Dorian mode is when you're playing it over a 2 minor 7 chord, there aren't any notes in it that clash. So I'm just going to play each of those notes in that mode. You notice, by the way, that each time I'm playing a scale, I'm going up to the a note above the first note, which makes it the ninth, and it gives it that colourful sound. So you notice that none of those notes clashed. Unlike in the Mixolydian mode, which was a C major scale starting on G over a G7 chord, that note clashes very, very badly with the B. So when you're improvising, it doesn't mean you can't play that note. It just means you don't sort of play it and hold it on for any length of time. And also try to make sure that it's going in between two chord notes like this. Now, as well as using the Dorian mode, you can also, just like we did with G7, you can extract various arpeggios out of the D minor 7 chord. So the first one is just an ordinary D minor 7, just root, third, fifth, and seventh. With my left hand, I'm just going to play a shell voicing, that's the root and the seventh. So that's the first arpeggio we can do. The second one is starting on the third. So there we've got the third of the chord, the fifth, the seventh, and the ninth. That's an upper extension. And if you look at that chord on its own, it's an F major 7 chord. The next one starts on the fifth of D minor 7. So now we've got the fifth, the seventh, the ninth, and the 11th. And on its own, that's an A minor 7 chord. And then we've got, starting on the seventh, so we've now got the seventh, the ninth, the 11th, and the 13th. On its own, play it down there. You can see that's a C major 7 chord. Now you can take pairs of those chords and you'd come up with a really convincing improvised line. For instance, out of the D minor 7 chord, if we take this chord, the A minor 7, and go to the D minor 7, even though we're not changing chord, we're staying on a D minor 7, if you outline those chords in the improvised line, you create a feeling of harmonic movement, of propelling forward. Now, you don't need to play all these different arpeggios in that one position. You can alter them into any position you like. So you could take that one, for instance, take the bottom note, put it up there, take the bottom note up there, and so on. And you can do that with all of them. So I'm going to just do a bar of D minor 7 like this. So just there, that was that position, moved up to there, but instead of going to the C and then the D, I just reversed it, D to C. So, and then I'm going to start the G7 on the third of the chord, B. Now all I'm playing there, I'm not even playing a G7 chord, I'm just playing a G triad with one chord note, and it's actually that note that I said clashes, but because I'm playing it quickly between two chord notes, you don't have time to feel that it's jarring. And then you could finish it with, so again I'm taking that one, moving the G up to the top, missing a note, and then coming back down, and then ending on the third of C major 7. It's very effective in what we call a cycle progression. That means the root of one chord moves down a fifth to the root of another one. So D minor 7 to G7, the root goes down a fifth, and then down a fifth from G7 to C major 7. So whenever you're improvising in a cycle progression, it's a good idea to start the next chord on the third of that chord. You don't have to, you can start wherever you like. And all the little guidelines, I sort of don't like calling them rules, they're guidelines really. They're ones that when you really get to understand it, you can then start doing lots and lots of different things. But if you just start saying, well, I can play any note I like, yeah, that's true, you might struggle to come up with anything that sounds convincing. So it's better to limit your resources to begin with and kind of master those limited resources and then add a little bit later on. So now, of course, we can combine the Dorian mode over the D minor 7 with the arpeggios. I could do 2 bars of just D minor 7 with something like this. And the next thing that's really interesting is that as well as the Dorian mode, the Bebop dominant scale, which we used over the G7, the dominant 7th chord, actually works great over the 2 minor 7 chord. So we can now do improvised lines using a combination of the Dorian Mixolydian modes, the Bebop dominant scale and the arpeggios, and come up with something like this. So I started the D minor 7 with part of the dominant scale, dominant Bebop scale, and then just went up an arpeggio. Now you notice on the G7 I'm actually playing one of the D minor 7 arpeggios before I then go on to using the Bebop dominant scale, and that has a very powerful effect. If you go on to the third of the G7 straight away, it doesn't sound quite as effective as this over a G. If I just play an octave G there, that is what we call an 11th chord. And it has a very strong feeling of wanting to resolve. So that note changes to that one. And if you do that, you get that feeling of, it's also known as a suspended chord of tension and then resolution. So putting that all together, as you start to study improvisation, you'll start to realize that you hear certain patterns over and over again. And a really simple one is this. There's something about the way that phrase ends. It sounds really sort of, stylistic for bebop music. There I was just playing a 2/5, but with just 2 beats each rather than a whole bar each. And you can create variations on that. So these little licks that you start to hear all the time really need to be part of your repertoire. Now, there's finally one more concept I want to introduce in this lesson, and that's approaching a chord note from a chromatic approach note. So a chromatic note is one that doesn't belong to the key, unlike the diatonic notes, which all come from the key that you're in. So if you're in C major, all the white notes are diatonic notes. All the chromatic notes in C major just happen to be black notes. Let's look at the D minor 7. You can approach each chord note from a semitone below. So the root from C sharp. So that's a chromatic approach note. The F, semitone below from the E, that's a diatonic note, but it still serves as an approach note. And then the A from G sharp and the C from the B. Now, I would try and limit the use of this for the moment, just to use it just before the third of a chord. So, for example, I'm going to play this slowly. D minor 7. We're approaching the third of G7, but we're going to approach it with the A sharp. And then I'm going to go up an arpeggio. And I'm now approaching the third of C major 7, but I'm approaching it with D sharp. Now that ending, by the way, you could as well do this. Instead of going, I just went down the Mixolydian mode there, or just the notes of an arpeggio really, and then the chromatic approach note to E. You could use the Bebop dominant scale there, and then from the F go straight to the D sharp. So those two patterns, I'll play them down there. And again, they're used all the time, and you need to sort of learn those in as many different keys as possible, and they'll become part of your repertoire. Okay, hope you enjoyed that. In the next video, I'm going to talk about what we do on chord 1, because in all these examples, I've just played up to the first note of chord 1. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.